Chapter 12 of Lessons Part 2. Rarity didn't realize just how long she had been working until, looking up after clearing away a chunk of brick the size of 2 ponies, she saw the first rays of dawn arcing across the sky. The sunlight swept over the city, accompanied by a light rain, the winter-chill drops carried into her coat by the gusting wind. They clung to her, carrying the grime and exhaustion with them as they carved trickling paths through the ash, and the small shivers they sent through her body were like breaths of fresh air after the numbness that had built up during the night. She blinked the bleariness from her eyes, seeing the surrounding city clearly for the first time in hours. Where once the courtyard surrounding the destroyed old fort had been filled with loose stone and rubble, now there were only a few of the largest pieces left. The groaning of the wounded, which had floated from the improvised triage house all through the night like the low chanting of some dread choir, had finally gone quiet as the last of the survivors were carted away to proper facilities, and the last of the dying, beyond the help of the exhausted nurses and surgeons, finally passed on. The other volunteers had gone home shortly after sunset, transforming the once bustling disaster zone into a sleepy, almost peaceful ruin. Piaf had left several hours ago, assigning a pair of blue-coat stallions to guard her. One was young, reminding her almost of Pontius with the wide-eyed manner in which he watched his more veteran partner when he thought nobody was looking. The other, old and quiet, communicated almost exclusively in a series of nods and frowns. It reminded her of Ivory at first, but Rarity hadn't spent long contemplating the likeness. She had been far too busy for that. She'd conscripted the 2 soldiers into serving as her assistants, directing them to help her wrap the heaviest piece of rubble in the fabric of a sturdy military tent. Once the material was in place, her special talent came into play, allowing her to move weights that would otherwise take a whole team of muscled laborers. A short break would be taken while she waited for the ensuing headache to fade, and then she'd direct her watchful companions toward the next obstacle. Right about then, Rarity's skull was pounding, worse than it had during even the most hectic fall fashion seasons. She felt as if she'd spent 3 straight days without sleep, putting together enough new lines for a whole week's worth of shows, and still there was more to do. She sighed through clenched teeth as she climbed to her hooves.
Countess? You're still here?
It took Rarity's mind a full second to recognize the voice. She turned to see River Pie approaching with obvious concern in her eyes.
Oh, Miss Pie, a pleasure.
She slapped a hoof over her mouth just in time to cover the ferocious yawn that overtook her.
Pleasure to see you again. Would you be a dear and help me?
River's eyes narrowed.
Countess, you need rest.
Rarity blinked, her mouth still hanging open. After a brief bout of concentration, she gathered her thoughts for a response.
But there's still more to do. Aye, but that doesn't mean you need to do it all on your own, Sim. Look at you. You're nearly falling where you stand.
Rarity looked between the 2 watching bluecoats incredulously.
And you 2 ain't stopped her?
The young one looked to the older. He cleared his throat, making way for a few hoarse words. We have our orders.
Oh, River, dear, let them be.
Rarity placed a hoof on River's shoulder, holding the fuming Baronlander back.
Captain Piaf already tried this, but there was still so much to do, and she knew it. I couldn't just leave. Well, you can leave now,
River said, gesturing behind her.
The Commoners' Guild is here to clean up the rest. Commoners' Guild?
Rarity followed River's hoof, picking out the gaggle of ponies stepping into view. There were perhaps 24 of them, all dressed in well-worn work clothes and organized into teams hitched up to battered metal wagons. Wood and rope were piled into the wagons, including 2 pairs of wide wooden wheels big enough for a pony to walk inside.
I go to their meetings.
River straightened up proudly.
We rounded up a few dock workers to come help with the biggest blocks. Manager didn't like it, of course, but not much she can do when her whole shift up and vanishes, cranes and all.
One of the new arrivals approached the pair, a nurse stallion with a ruddy green coat and a dark mane tied into a ponytail that hung down his neck. His work vest was a plain brown, and it might have gone nicely with the wide-brimmed hat he wore if not for the frayed threads hanging off the sleeves. He came to a stop at River's side, looking to her with a nervous smile. She beamed back at him, nodding in Rarity's direction. A few seconds passed. Rarity cocked her head as the stallion stole an awkward glance towards her.
Miss Pie?
Rarity asked.
Perhaps you'd like to introduce us? Looks as if the duty's fallen to me.
River held a hoof out towards Rarity, who dipped into a quick, tired curtsy.
Countess Rarity of Canthathusia, the gifted mare I've told you about.
She brought the hoof towards the stallion, who was smiling at the space above Rarity's head.
And Twinkle Smith, a friend of mine from the Commoners Guild. Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Smith.
Rarity extended a hoof. The pleasure's all mine, Countess. He lunged forwards, pulling Rarity into a hug with alarming speed.
Oh!
Rarity's two guards stiffened off to the side, but she was quick to wave them down with a hoof. She tried to pull herself free of the hug, letting out a breathy giggle as she met resistance.
Some space, perhaps, darling?
Oh, right. Sorry. Twinkle stepped back, leaving Rarity to wobble slightly before regaining her balance. I was just so excited to meet you. River's told us all about you, you know? Rarity shot River a curious look, causing the mare to turn away with a barely perceptible blush.
Hush she now.
Is it all true? Twinkle leaned in, lowering his voice as if asking after some conspiracy. Are you really from the past? You're here to make Equestria like it used to be? When the princesses were still around? Before the floods?
Well...
Rarity hesitated, put off by the reverence in the stallion's voice.
I will certainly do my best.
Twinkle beamed, his eyes finally flicking up to meet hers for a brief moment. He turned to River Pie, who was watching with an apologetic smile. Do you think she'll attend a meeting? Rarity waved a lazy hoof, drawing his attention back.
Right here, Mr. Smith. You'll have to excuse him. He's just a little excited is all.
River dipped her muzzle into the bag at her side, pulling out a small card.
The members meet here every day, but most of them can't attend except on Sundays.
Rarity accepted the card in her magic, ignoring the little gasp from Twinklesmith, and squinted down at the tiny font. It was difficult to focus on, the words in her current state, so she just slipped the card into her pocket, soon into her ruined, rolled-up dress.
Apologies. What did you say the meetings were about, dear?
Common good, Twinkle announced. The guildmasters of Frieseland have little care for anything aside from business, and so we assembled into our own guild, the Commoners Guild. River nodded.
We open the crops poor, homes start falling apart and the like.
Behind her, the dock workers had already started unloading their wagons. They moved with the casual precision of experience, assembling the cranes in stony quiet.
Though it's difficult to do much more, seeing as we can only rely on donations of time and bits. I see,
Rarity mumbled. This Commoners Guild could make for a useful ally in her attempts to stop the war, and Whitehorn would certainly be interested in hearing about them. Her thoughts were interrupted by another yawn, so powerful that she actually stumbled a step to the side when she raised a hoof to cover her mouth.
Oh, goodness. Go home, Countess. Please.
River put a hoof on Rarity's shoulder to steady her, the concern returning to her eyes.
You've done more than your fair share. We can handle the rest.
Rarity opened her mouth to protest once more, but she was interrupted by a gruff call from the dock workers. The first crane had been assembled, and a pair of ponies had already wrapped a boulder-sized chunk of rubble in a sling before hooking it to the thick rope that ran up to a pulley down the crane leg, and to a winch suspended between a pair of large wooden wheels. The ponies inside each wheel began to walk, the crane leg groaning in complaint as the huge stone was hefted into the air, and a team of ponies on the ground began guiding the load into one of the now empty wagons. The team hitched to the wagon pulled, tugging it into motion with quiet grunts of exertion, and within moments were guiding it down the street and out of sight. One of the ponies on the crane glanced towards Rarity and offered up a brief nod before turning back to his work. Rarity blinked, sluggish thoughts pushing past the miasma of her exhaustion. The hours caught up to her all at once. Her hind legs gave out as her rear plumped down to the ground, and she nearly blacked out right there, the darkness encroaching on her vision for a frightening moment, before she shook her head and pushed it back. She groaned, raising a hoof to her head in a vain attempt to stem the pulsing ache at the base of her horn.
Countess!
River stepped closer, supporting Rarity's weight.
Are you well? I'm fine, darling. Thank you.
Rarity winced as the vibrations of her own voice bounced around in her skull.
I think I just pushed myself a bit too far. We should get you back to your bed,
River said.
Where are you staying, by the way?
The older bluecoat cleared his throat, drawing River's attention. That's none of your concern, Baronlander. The Frieseland guard will see to it that the Countess finds her way safely back to her lodging. As he spoke, the younger soldier stepped meaningfully forwards, and River backed away without complaint. Rarity groaned as she forced herself back to her hooves.
I appreciate your concern, Miss Pie, but I do trust these, gentle colts to see me back. Oof.
She grimaced at the ache in her legs as she turned to face the courtyard's eastern exit.
Truly a pleasure to see you again, despite the circumstances.
River nodded, offering up a small smile.
With luck, our next meeting won't be so dire.
Perhaps tomorrow at the guild meeting, Twinklesmith added. Rarity let out a breathy chuckle.
If I'm up to it, darling. Ta-ta!
With a nod, the older soldier led the way. The younger stayed by Rarity's side as they walked, subtly stepping closer whenever she faltered to lend support. Rarity did her best to focus on her surroundings as they went, noting the quicker pace and quieted tones of the citizens. Plumes of smoke drifted across the eastern horizon, pushing a distant concern for Fluttershy past the thick blanket of her exhaustion. She almost didn't notice that they had arrived, until the very moment she stepped over the threshold of Piaf's home. The captain was seated at the table with Whitehorn, each nursing drinks with a thin book splayed out between them, while Pontius had been standing by the window. The coltish stallion rushed up to her at once, nearly bowling her over with his arrival, eyes wide as he took in her disheveled form.
My lady, what's happened to you? Oh, heavens.
Rarity put a hoof to his chest, pushing him back.
I'm fine, thank you, dear. Some space, please?
She stepped back with a grimace, giving her room to step towards the stairs. She paused, turning to face Captain Piaf and Whitehorn and receiving understanding nods from each. With a weary smile, she began her ascent. Pontius followed her, unfortunately.
I haven't seen you since the bombing. What happened to you? Did those soldiers do this, my lady?
Rarity took a deep breath as she reached the top of the stairs.
No need to be upset, Rarity. He only has the best intentions.
She opened the door to her room with a hoof, turning in the threshold to face Pontius before he could follow her inside.
It's very noble of you to be worried, darling,
she said, slowly closing the door in his face.
But I would quite like to get some sleep right now.
The door shut with a satisfying click. She waited, counting 3 heartbeats, and let out a sigh of relief when she heard him walking back downstairs.
Rarity!
Rarity winced as Pinkie's shrill voice jammed into her ears. pink hooves wrapped around her neck a moment later.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're back! I was super duper worried when Piaf came back without you when it got dark, and you said you'd stayed behind and there were these big fires over in the caves of Fluttershy staying, but nobody would tell me anything, and it was so windy outside last night so I could barely sleep because I was thinking about how you might be out there shivering because you didn't get a dress for a cold night, and then it started to rain!
Pinkie sucked in a great gasp of breath.
Pinkie!
Rarity clumsily slapped a hoof over the other mare's mouth.
It's wonderful to see you again, darling, and I do appreciate your concern, but I'd quite like to...
She raised her other hoof to stifle a yawn, nearly falling over in the process.
Catch up on my beauty sleep.
Pinkie blinked, pulling back and looking Rarity over with her curious blue eyes. After a few moments, she broke out into a wide smile.
Oh, Rarity, you don't need any beauty sleep. You don't have any bags under your eyes, and your coat hasn't lost its usual luster, and your mane is just as vibrant and full as always, and you definitely haven't been slurring your words under your breath this whole time. Quite, yes.
Rarity's horn glowed as she pulled the ragged remains of her outfit free and hung them limply over her dresser. Her legs went limp as she dove face first into the bed. She didn't even bother to pull her muzzle free from the comforting fabric when she spoke.
Wake me up at noon, dear.
If the bed did anything to muffle her voice, Pinkie didn't seem to have any issue understanding. Rarity was just cognizant enough to hear the other mare's giggling response before the warm abyss of sleep overtook her. A small smile graced her lips as she snuggled into the pillows.
I've got it!
A wide grin split Twilight's face as she turned a slow circle, taking in the documents and notes she had pinned to the walls around her. A few seconds passed as she nodded in satisfaction, and nothing answered her. She cleared her throat and stomped a hoof, prodding at midnight with a spike of impatience.
I said I've got it!
A pair of slitted eyes appeared in Twilight's shadow, half-lidded with boredom. Twilight clapped her hooves together in glee as she beamed at her shadow, waiting for it to ask her about her findings. And waited. A mouth joined the eyes, its fanged maw stretching wide in an exaggerated yawn. Twilight's tail flicked behind her.
Ask me what I've learned!
Midnight rolled her eyes.
Go on then. I can tell you're just dying to share. Fine!
Twilight snapped.
Be that way! Ugh.
Midnight's low echoed in Twilight's ears, and she turned to face the note she'd carefully laid out in the blank pages of Shining Armor's journal.
Okay, so we have our beginning state, the Canterlot wedding, and our end state, flooded Equestria.
She levitated her pencil as she spoke, jabbing at eraser first at two ends of the timeline she had doodled out. The glow of her horn brightened as she pulled a dozen faded newspapers from their stack, all from dates shortly after the wedding, and scanned the headlines, her eyes lingering on a faded, black and white image of Celestia giving a speech before a crowd in Ponyville.
Canterlot was evacuated in the wake of the invasion, and somehow the princesses cast a solid stone sphere around Shiny's shield spell.
She stuck her pencil's eraser between her lips, chewing on it in consternation.
Which is ridiculous. A spell like that is orders of magnitude beyond any earth-shaping magic I've read of before. She's an alicorn, is she not?
Midnight asked.
With the way you fawn over Celestia, is it truly so shocking that she and her sister could muster such power?
Twilight shook her head.
They're unmatched magic users within their domains, yes, but a strong unicorn can still keep up otherwise. Stone, spheres, shaping, I can't think of any way that a spell like that could possibly be relevant to the sun or moon. With the sheer mass involved, even a dozen archmages with the relevant cutie marks would burn their magic out. And yet, the spell was cast.
Midnight sidled up to Twilight's side, peering over her shoulder.
Perhaps you missed something? I've gone over everything in this room 4 times, and you watched me do it!
Twilight's nostrils flared as she moved on from the nagging question marks in her notes.
The next thing we do know for sure is that the Royal Guard set up a defensive line around the city and began making preparations for a counterattack. But then...
She pulled the pencil free from her gnawing teeth, pointing it at a photograph of a guard mare with red tears dripping down her cheeks.
The corruption started.
Midnight snorted.
You ruined another pencil.
Twilight blinked. Her eyes focused in on what was once the pencil's eraser, and a dejected sigh escaped her as she saw the eviscerated wooden stump. She threw it into the pile with the others before opening a desk drawer and pulling out a replacement. Luckily, whoever had used this office before her had practiced a level of office supply preparation bordering past obsessive. She stuck the pencil into the sharpener as she continued her presentation.
It was most prominent around Canterlot at first, so the going theory was that the changelings were the source, but nobody could find a way to stop the spread.
She pulled the freshly sharpened pencil out, pointing at a map of Equestria heavily annotated by her notes.
Corruption-related incidents happened all around Equestria with increasing severity, up to the date of the flood, which seems to have happened only...
She grimaced, looking down at her notes.
2 months after my capture. Blaming yourself again, little flower?
Twilight shook her head with a quiet sniffle.
I should have been there. They needed me. It is not the fault of the strong that the weak should perish.
Midnight's voice was sweet in Twilight's head, the warmth only partially concealing an underpinning of pride.
Why should a manticore mourn the passing of insects?
Twilight sucked in a deep breath, gritting her teeth and willing the thick red tears back as she turned to the 3 names written under the timeline.
Princess Luna disappeared during a research expedition to the Everfree 3 weeks after the wedding. My current theory is a self-induced dream coma once she realized she'd been infected by the corruption.
Twilight's eyes flicked to the side, meeting Midnight's toothy smile with silent accusation.
Don't look at me. You know I had no involvement in any of that. We belong to each other and none else, my sweet.
Twilight shivered as she turned back to her notes.
Shiny's journal mentions every Thestral in the Guard disappearing at around the same time. No indicators as to why or where they may have gone. His journal also mentions Princess Cadence leading a mission to the Frozen North on Celestia's behalf, just a week later. None of the newspapers here mention her return. It's probable that she also fell to the corruption. She does strike me as the weakest of the set.
Midnight mused.
I expect we'll find her body.
Twilight's voice hitched as she slid her pencil over to a photo. A black and white portrait of a bruised, shining armor she'd cut out of a newspaper.
We know that Shiny...
She bit her lip, hesitating over the next word.
Died during an attempted rescue mission in Canterlot, just a week before the flood.
Midnight was silent as Twilight's magic wrapped around the journal, revealing a page conspicuously empty of notes. A wallet-sized photo of Princess Celestia, a mass-produced thing pilfered from the magically preserved filing cabinet, was pinned at the top. Even with the faded colors, Twilight felt her pulse quicken at the sight. Beneath the photo was a form, one of many she'd found in a folder detailing official correspondence between the office of the Stalingrad Premier and the subcommittees that ran the city. It was dated just a day before the flood, the day when all the newspapers stopped printing, and ponies all around the underground vault had written their deepest fears in their private diaries. The message was short, to the point, and it sent a shiver down Twilight's spine every time she read it. Princess Celestia has vanished. We are on our own.